Okay, sorry about that. You may have heard my dog in the last clip alerting me to someone ringing the doorbell. I'm going to pick up where I left off with the Chapter 13 lecture. Okay, so as I was saying with this population of ladybird beetles, these are all the same species, but you can see that there are varying shades of orange here, as well as differing number of spots, as well as how big those spots are. So this is an example of a population in which evolution could act on existing variation. So the inference from these observations that Darwin wrote about was that unequal reproductive success existed. That just means that some individuals are going to be more successful at leaving a genetic legacy than are others. So those individuals with traits that are best suited to the local environment generally leave a larger share of surviving fertile offspring. Examples of natural selection include pesticide-resistant insects, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and drug-resistant strains of HIV. Here we have a little bit more of an in-depth example. There are more than 500 species of insects that now exhibit some form of pesticide resistance. So as a result of that, there are companies that are constantly researching new pesticides that could be more effective. So here we have a population of beetles that are damaging to some sort of crop, maybe soybeans. And what we see inside of these beetles are representations of a chromosome. This is, of course, a very simplified example. This is just one chromosome within these beetles. But imagine these beetles were sprayed with an insecticide, and one of these beetles happens to have a chromosome with a gene that confers resistance to that insecticide. So perhaps it manufactures an enzyme within its nervous system that actually can break down that pesticide before it has damaging effects on the nervous system. Well, what's going to happen when you spray that population with an insecticide? All of the individuals without that gene are going to die, but the individuals that do have that gene are going to survive, and they are going to be the individuals that end up reproducing. Since most all traits that we can observe, and even those we can't observe, have a genetic basis, those survivors are going to pass on that gene, such that future generations are all going to have that gene. And of course, it might not just happen in one generation. There are going to be some individuals that were outside of the range of this spray plane, for example, that are going to come in here and mate with the survivors. But this is basically just an abbreviated view of what natural selection can look like. So additional application of the same pesticide is going to be less effective, and the frequency of resistant insects in the population is going to grow. I'm going to show you another example of how scientists can test an evolutionary hypothesis. So this is an example of the process of science that is taken directly out of your book, and a group of researchers observed that flat-tailed horned lizards defend against attack by thrusting their heads backward and stabbing a shrike, which is a type of predatory bird, with the spiked horns on the rear of their skull. So those researchers had the question, are longer horn length and spread a survival advantage? The prediction was that live horned lizards are going to have longer and more widely spread horns than individuals that were found dead by shrike by the researchers. So the experiment involved measuring the horn lengths and the tip-to-tip spread distance of side horns from the skulls of 29 dead lizards that were killed by shrikes and 155 living lizards. Now, you may note that these are very disparate or different sample sizes. And unequal sample sizes can be an issue when you're interpreting results. So when you're looking at how a scientific study was conducted, sample size is always going to be important. In this case, of course, the researchers were not able to find a large sample of lizards that had been killed by shrikes. They were able to find a lot more lizards that were living. So you just have to keep in mind the limitations of the study in interpreting the results. The results were that the average horn length and spread of live lizards is about 10% greater than that of killed lizards. So you may be asking yourself, how in the world did these researchers find the bodies of lizards that had been killed by shrikes, and how on earth would you know for sure that those lizards had been killed by shrikes? Well, this is an example of a lizard that has been killed by a shrike. I actually took this picture in South Central Oregon, and it is a horned lizard that has been killed by a shrike. Shrikes have this very odd and sort of grisly habit of impaling their victims on branches. So the researchers could be sure that their population was actually indeed killed by shrikes. This is an example of a live lizard here in a defensive posture. You can see that it is thrusting the spikes on its head upward in an attempt to defend itself against a predator. And here we have the remains of a lizard that were impaled by a shrike. So what these researchers found was that the rear horns on live lizards were slightly longer in length than those found on killed lizards, and that the tip-to-tip spread of the side horns, so these here, was greater in length than lizards that were live. Or, sorry, lizards that were live had a greater tip-to-tip spread than those that were killed. Okay, so that's just an example of one scientific study that has been published and that supports the theory of evolution via natural selection. So the lizards that were killed were less well adapted to their environment. They were removed from the breeding population, and what we would expect over evolutionary time, assuming that the shrikes are still an important predator throughout that period of time, is that the lizards will basically be entering what's known as an evolutionary arms race with the shrikes, that the lizards are going to continue to develop longer horn lengths and greater spread between horns, and the shrikes are going to similarly evolve in such a way that they can continue to kill these lizards. Darwin saw the history of life as analogous to a tree. So the first forms of life on Earth form the common trunk, and at each fork resides the last common ancestor to all the branches that extend from that fork. The tips of millions of twigs represent the species that we see living on Earth today. As an example of this, we have this evolutionary tree here. Again, the branches of these trees represent last common ancestors, and as you can see in blue are various novel adaptations. So before lungfishes evolved, there was a common ancestor here that gave rise to the branch that led to amphibians, which in turn split from a common ancestor that gave rise to the amnion, which is an adaptation regarding the development of the fetus. And there was a common ancestor that gave rise to mammals, as well as all of these other existing taxa. So these traits that are listed in blue are homologous traits, so they are similar due to common ancestry, and they are shared by all the groups that came after that evolutionary adaptation. The modern synthesis is the fusion of genetics with evolutionary biology. So this is really the field of study in which Darwinism meets modern genetic studies. Remember that a population is a group of individuals of the same species living in the same place at the same time, and is the smallest biological unit that can evolve. So an individual cannot evolve. However, a population of individuals is capable of evolving. Here we have an example of populations. We have populations of evergreen trees that are separated by a lake. And this is just a nice little nighttime satellite view of North America. So we can see here we have population centers that are denoted by lights, and of course human populations are more likely to evolve within population centers. So we are more likely to find a partner and produce children with that partner in areas close to where we actually live. Of course, that changes a little bit with the age of the internet and international travel, but we're still less likely to find someone that lives in another part of the country and actually produce offspring with that person. Species can generally be defined as members of a group of organisms that can only produce offspring with other members of this group. So this is commonly referred to as the biological species concept, and it's the working definition that most biological courses of study use. Of course, some exceptions exist, such as hybrids. Here we have two separate species of lizards, and if they are able to produce offspring together, that offspring is generally going to have a blending of traits from those two parent organisms. The total collection of alleles, or alternate forms of genes, within a population at any one time can be referred to as the gene pool. So when the relative frequency of alleles changes over a number of generations, evolution is occurring on its smallest scale. Individual variation abounds in all species, but not all variation in a population is heritable. So some variation is due to changes that occur throughout our lifetime that are not dictated by genetics. And it's important to keep in mind that only the genetic component of variation is relevant to natural selection. Of course, you have to remember that during the process of meiosis, we have segregation of traits. So what we have here is an illustration of a cell with homologous chromosomes. So these two large ones are homologous chromosomes, and these two small ones are also homologous chromosomes. So what happens prior to cell division is each of those individual chromosomes duplicates. So what you end up with here is one cell with sister chromatids here, and another cell with sister chromatids here. Now, what can occur during the process of meiosis is crossing over. Remember that crossing over is the exchange of genetic information between non-sister chromatids of homologous chromosomes. So sexual reproduction is very good at producing novel combinations of alleles. So you end up with a lot of variation within the sperm cells and within the egg cells, and you end up with even more variation due to various combinations of sperm and egg cells forming the next generation. Here we have a photograph of 4 garter snakes. These were all captured within a field in Oregon, but they are all actually the same species. We just have a lot of different variations